Hi class, this is Sir Alex. Welcome to our lesson in General Biology 1. Today we'll be discussing lesson 7.1, which is all about biological macromolecules. Today we'll be focusing on carbohydrates, which is part of biological macromolecules. Okay, to start us off, let's see what will be the goals of today's lesson. So at the end of the lesson, I want everyone to be able to describe the components of an enzyme, be able to explain oxidation reduction reactions, and be able to determine how factors such as pH, which is a measure of acidity and base, as well as temperature and substrate affect enzyme activity. So this would be the main goal of the total lessons of lesson 7, but for now we're going to focus first on understanding what is carbohydrates. So let's begin discussing first by understanding what are biological macromolecules. Biological macromolecules are basically large molecules that are necessary for life. So these are molecules that are necessary for the body to have for our normal functioning and for normal life functioning and in order for us to live. Um, all of our biological macromolecules, these large macromolecules, are created by building upon the smaller organic molecules. So you have much smaller organic molecules, and they basically attach together and create the larger macromolecules that we need in order for us to live. And there are four major classes of biological macromolecules. First is carbohydrates, which would be the main focus of today's lesson. The second one are lipids, which we also call fats. Second are proteins. And the third are nucleic acid, which composes or which are necessary in order for us to create DNA. So we'll be discussing lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids in our later lessons. But again, let's discuss first the biocarbohydrates. But before we can start understanding carbohydrates, let's go into smaller pieces first by understanding what is carbon. So carbon is basically an element in the um, table of elements, and it is you might have heard that life is carbon based. That is because us organic life, most of the things that are organic macromolecules or molecules are molecules that are mainly composed of carbon. And these carbons can be bonded to other elements or they are basically bonded to each other, creating long chains of carbons, which eventually creates the macromolecules that we have. All of us, yung mga katawan natin, we are all basically carbon-based. So it's just a bunch of carbons bonded together, creating chains, resulting in creation of our yung mga proteins sa katawan natin, our bones, our skins, everything. We're basically carbon-based. And not only us, no? Lahat ng products na meron tayo are a lot of them are carbon-based. The paper that you have right now, the computer that you have are all carbon-based. So life is carbon-based. So here's a carbon. Carbon has 6 electrons in its shells. The first electrons in its first shell has 2 electrons, and its valence shell. When we talk about valence shells, that is the outermost shell of an element. As for carbon, in its outermost shell or in its valence shell has 4 electrons around it. So usually these electrons are, moving around, and instead of like letter E na ganito that moves around, it resembles more of a electron cloud that surrounds the carbon. But the important thing that we have to focus are those 4 outermost electrons, no, sa kanyang valence shell. Because in carbon bonding, these 4 electrons found in its outermost shell, are the ones that creates the covalent bonding that results in chains and other structures that we have today. Examples, we can create chains of carbon. So you have a bunch of C's here, and they connect together in one of their electrons in their outermost shell, and then they can continue creating this chain, this long chain of carbons, as well as this could be a branched chain wherein there's another sticking out carbon, and you can even connect carbon, you know, on the other end, and you can create more than one branch chain. It could be seven or whatever, how many or however how many it is needed to create a certain molecule. Like it could also create a closed chain wherein, as you can see here, the carbons connect together forming a closed structure. So we have a three carbons here creating three, kind of like a triangle. You have here creating like a square, and then it can also create an hexagon. And hexagon shape is actually the most stable conformation of a closed chain structure. Not only are these the way that the carbons can bond together, but they can also uh, bond differently. No, it could be a single bonds, wherein you have a one of the electrons in the outermost shell connects with the other electrons in its outermost shell. But you could also have two electrons connecting together. So two electrons from one carbon connected to the other two electrons in the other carbon, and you can even have triple bonds. No? So it depends on the structure that the molecules have, depends on kung anong klaseng bonds and kung anong klaseng chain meron siya. Okay, so that is all about carbon bonding. So why is this important? It's because our biological macromolecules are basically just bunch of carbons in different shapes and chains in different bonds. So today we are talking about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates has a base molecular structure, which we use this. So a common carbon usually has a ratio of 1 is to 2 is to 1 carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Usually, the number of carbons and oxygen in a carbohydrates are equally the same, and the number of hydrogens in that configuration or in that shape is usually twice as much as how many carbons you have. And this n number here, it is usually how many carbons you have. So for example, if n is 3, you would have C3H6O3. And the most common number that you probably have heard is 12, C12 or 6, C6H12O6, which is the chemical, what do you call this, the chemical structure or the chemical composition of glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6. And as you can see here, it follows the conformation that we have here. So however, how many carbons you have is usually the same number of oxygen you have, and the number of hydrogen you have is usually twice as much as you have um, carbons. So if you have 6 here, that's C6H12, 6 times 2 is 12, and 6 times 1 is 6, so C6H12O6. It could also be C5H10O10. So it depends on however how many carbons you have, but this configuration follows a carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are essential part of people's diet because we can find them in grains, fruits, and vegetables. Those are very good source of carbohydrates, no? But for the most part, when you talk about carbohydrates, you might immediately think of bread and rice, and those are parts of grains, and that is true. But fruits and vegetables also have carbohydrates because sugars are carbohydrates. Fruits has a lot of sugar, and that sugar, we call them fructose, is a carbohydrate. The same thing with vegetables. They have some form of sugar. For example, is onions. Onion actually has a lot of sugar. So when you caramelize onion, no, when you're cooking, you kind of like to caramelize that onion. It creates the sweeter flavor. No? That is because of the sugar or the carbohydrates present in onions. And again, so carbohydrates does not only come from grains like we usually commonly know, like bread, rice, wheat. No, they can also come from fruits and vegetables. Carbohydrates are necessary because they provide energy to the body, particularly in form of glucose. Because remember, glucose, the 6H12O6, is a simple sugar that comes from all of these grains, fruits, vegetables. And This is necessary, glucose is necessary for creating ATPs in the body. So if you guys remember the um, antiport, wherein when sodium goes inside to the body or goes outside of the body, um, a glucose gets inside, or no, sorry, when sodium gets inside the body, uniport, glucose also comes into the body inside the cell. We've talked about cell transport, and they're putting glucose inside the cell in order to use that glucose for cellular respiration to create ATPs. So there are three different kinds of carbohydrates. We have monosaccharides, which are simple sugars. Example is glucose. And monosaccharides usually compose of 3 to 6 carbons. No? So 3 to 6 carbons. So when you have a structure that has 3 to 6 carbons, so C3H6O3, that is a type of monosaccharide. In this case, glucose is 6 carbons, so that's C6H12O6. Glucose is a type of monosaccharides. And they usually end with glucose or O's, no? Example, glucose. Um, and they usually the way you call them depends on how many numbers of carbons you have. So if you have five, that's penta. Pentagon means five polygon, no? Penta is five, so pentose are type of monosaccharides. We also have disaccharides. Disaccharides, it's kind of like easy to understand because disaccharides is basically a combination of two simple sugars. So if you have a glucose and another glucose, you can create a disaccharide. So combination happens through the process of dehydration. So we have to remove an H2O and in the structure in order to combine the two sugar, to combine the two monosaccharides. So I will show later how that happens. But yeah, that's how disaccharides are formed. And then we have polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are basically long chains of monosaccharides. Polysaccharides, um, poly meaning many. So many sweets. Saccharides means sweets. So one sweets, two sweets, many sweets. So many meaning we have more than two monosaccharides combined together, forming a chain, and that creates our polysaccharides. Some of our polysaccharides include starches, glycogen, cellulose, and chitin. And all of these has different function for different living organisms such as human, insects, and even plants. And we'll be discussing them today as well. So first, let's begin discussing monosaccharides. Like I've mentioned, monosaccharides are basically simple sugars that compose of 3 to 6 carbons. And they usually end with O's as their name. So you can have, for example, trioses. So trioses are monosaccharides that has 3 carbons. So that would be C3H6. This should be 3. No? So this is O3. C3H6O3. You can also have pentoses. Penta means 5. So have you have a sugar with 5 carbons that creates a carbohydrates that is C5H10O5. You can also have hexoses, which are C6H12O6. So you may see also C6H12O6. I thought that's glucose. Yeah, it's glucose. Glucose is a type of hexoses. This is because even though you have this structure right here, or this you have these numbers right here, it doesn't mean they can only form one structure, because monosaccharides may exist as linear or ring shape. Now, this C6H12O6 can be formed as a linear or it can be a ring shape. Moreover, um, and they're usually ring shape in aqueous solution. Moreover, there are various types of hexoses. So glucose is a type of hexose, same thing as galactose and fructose are. So all of these, glucose, galactose, fructose, have C6H12O6. So they have 6 carbon atoms in them. But the difference is that they have different structure. We call that isomers. Isomers means they have the same number of atoms. Yeah, so glucose, galactose, fructose are types of hexose. They all have this same number of carbons, C6, same numbers of hydrogens, and same number of oxygens, but their differences relies in their structure. And yeah, we call them isomers. So here's a picture. So this is a glucose, no? This is a galactose, and this is a fructose. So you may think, magkakaparehas lang naman sila. It's not, they may look the same, but their structure is actually not the same. So you have here, in the beginning, you have um, double bonded to um, oxygen right here, and then you might see pagdating mo dun sa fourth carbon dito. So you can see this galactose has an OH group on, let's say, on the fourth carbon, but as you can see here, it has an OH, but it's on the other side. Okay, and that simple change is enough to change the structure of our, this type is a type of ring, no? It changes the structure, and therefore making it a different molecule already. So we're not gonna go deep into that, but yeah, just changing the position of where the OH is. So you can see here the OH is on top, but the OH here at the fourth carbon is below. The rest is the same, but just that difference in OH changes this structure from glucose to galactose. And here fructose is different because, as you can see, it's not a six ring structure. It's a ring structure, but it doesn't have six sides, it has five sides. So, and then, as you can see here, unlike glucose and galactose, the second carbon here is where you can find the double bonded oxygen, or yeah, double bonded oxygen, not on the first carbon. So yeah, they have the same number of atoms, C6H12O6, but their shapes are different. So glucose is an important source of energy because that's what the cell used to create ATPs. Galactose is a sugar that is part of lactose, which is from milk. So in order to create lactose, which is a sugar from milk, we have to have a galactose. Lactose is a type of disaccharide. So one part of lactose is a monosaccharide galactose. Because remember, disaccharides are basically a combination of two monosaccharides. So one of those is galactose. And fructose are sugar found in fruits. Now let's go with disaccharides. So kanina nabanggit ko that disaccharides are two monosaccharides that attaches via what we call dehydration reaction. So here you have two. Um, let's just wait for it to reset. So you have two monosaccharides here. Yeah. Um, not the, I think this is, yeah, this is a fructose, and we have a glucose. So in order for two monosaccharides to attach together, they have to remove one oxygen and two hydrogen. So this is what we call the process of dehydration. So we are removing one atom of H2O. So what happens is one OH from one monosaccharide is being removed, and one, so yung OH na remove siya dito, and then yung isang H also gets removed from one monosaccharides, leaving the O. So these two are reacting. So naiwan yung O, and that O is what connects, that oxygen is what connects the two monosaccharides together. And that connection, pag nag-connect na sila, that's how you create disaccharides. So you have different examples of disaccharides. So you can create sucrose, which is a combination of glucose and fructose. We can create lactose. So nabanggit kanina, lactose is sugar from milk, and it's a combination of galactose and glucose. Then we can also create maltose, which is a combination of two glucose. Okay, so these are the most common disaccharides that we have that I want you guys to remember. Sucrose is glucose fructose, glucose galactose is lactose, and two glucoses is maltose. But that's basically what disaccharides are. Now let's move on to polysaccharides. What are polysaccharides? So we mentioned earlier, polysaccharides are basically long chains of monosaccharides. So it involves three or more chains of monosaccharides that attaches together. And since it's a long chain of monosaccharides, they are very large molecules compared to their monosaccharide and disaccharides counterpart. And we have four types. No? We have starches, cellulose, glycogen, and chitin. So starches are basically disaccharides that are stored sugars from, say, stored form of sugars in plants. So you can usually find starches, for example, in starchy potatoes like russet potatoes. Um, Corn has starch on them. Now rice has a starch on them. So usually plant products has starch on them. And that starch is a type of polysaccharides. And they're usually made up of glucose polymers. So glucose polymers, basically, it's a polymers, poly meaning many. It's a many chain of glucose that are called amylose and amylopectin. Okay, so starches are basically amylose and amylopectin, but we just commonly call them as starches, and they are long chains polymers, long chains of glucose. And of course, as you create longer chain, they could be branch or they could be straight, no? And kapag nagiba lang yung branch, of course, it's a different molecule altogether. But we're not gonna focus on their structure because that would take a lot of time to see ano ba yung structure niya. But just remember that starches are basically long chains of glucose called amylose and amylopectin, and they are stored form of sugars sa plants. Next is we have glycogen. Glycogens are stored form of sugars, but this time they are found in humans and other vertebrates. No? So yung mga stored sugars sa mga katawan natin, especially sa humans, no? And this is usually used when we have low levels of glucose. So this is one way for the body to conserve energy. And when, for example, if you hadn't had any time to eat, the reason na hindi ka nanghihina agad, it's because you have that stored energy from glycogen. If you have low level of glucose and the body needs to create ATPs, the body will start to break the glycogen. No? And by breaking that glycogen, it can extract glucose wherein the body can use the body can use to create ATPs. So glycogen are stored form of glucose that are found in humans and other vertebrates. Cellulose are a type of polysaccharides, but this time they're very abundant. These are one of the most abundant biological polymers. So these are long chains that are basically found almost everywhere in the world. That is because you can find them in plants' cell walls. So yung cell wall ng plant are basically what we call cellulose, and they're long chains of monosaccharides. No? And it gives the plant cell the structure support it needs in order for it to stand erect. So yung mga plants na nakita nyo, the trees, yung cell wall nila are created by cellulose, which are long chains of monosaccharides. And lastly, chitin. Chitin is basically long chains of monosaccharides, and they are used in exoskeleton ng mga crabs, ng insects, and spiders. So exoskeleton is basically the hard carapace or the shell na nakapaligid dun sa crab. So, or sa lobsters. So, those are exoskeleton. And insects also has exoskeleton. So those outer structure that could protect these crabs and insects and other arthropods. And yung structure nila are basically polysaccharides. They're basically a long chain of monosaccharides. So that is all about carbohydrates. We still have three more to discuss: lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. but we're gonna do that in our next discussion. So if you guys have any questions about carbohydrates, do not hesitate to ask, and have a good